Imagine a world where rivers part at God's command, walls collapse at the sound of trumpets, and the sun itself obeys a warrior's prayer. Welcome to Joshua, the most explosive book in the Bible that transforms slaves into conquerors. Here God's promises stop being words and become reality. This isn't just conquest, it's divine fulfillment of a 400-year-old covenant. Joshua stands as the hinge between wilderness wandering and promised land victory, revealing how ordinary people become extraordinary through faith. Every chapter unleashes supernatural warfare, strategic brilliance, and unwavering obedience that reshapes nations. This book proves that when God fights for his people, defeat becomes impossible and victory becomes inevitable. Prepare to witness why Joshua earned the title of God's greatest warrior and discover the timeless principles that still conquer giants today. The moment had finally arrived. Moses, the great deliverer who had led Israel out of Egypt, was gone. For 40 years, he had been their voice, their guide, their connection to the Almighty. Now standing at the edge of the Promised Land, the people faced an uncertain future. Who would lead them now? God wasted no time. He came to Joshua, Moses' assistant, with words that would change everything. As recorded in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, the Lord said, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses." Joshua wasn't just getting a promotion. He was receiving a divine commission. The same God who had spoken to Moses was now speaking to him. The promise was clear and direct. Every step Joshua took in the land would claim territory for Israel. This wasn't just about military conquest, it was about divine inheritance. But God knew Joshua's heart. He understood the weight of following in Moses' footsteps, so he gave Joshua something Moses never had, a personal promise of victory. In verses 5 and 6, God declared, "No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them." 3 times in this conversation, God told Joshua to be strong and courageous. This wasn't casual encouragement, it was a divine command. God knew what lay ahead. He knew about the giants in the land, the fortified cities, the armies that would oppose them. But he also knew something Joshua was still learning. With God's presence, no enemy could stand. The secret to Joshua's strength wasn't in his military training or natural abilities. As God explained in verses 7 and 8, "Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go." Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Success would come through obedience to God's word. Joshua's strength would be found in staying close to the instructions God had already given. This wasn't about human wisdom or strategy. It was about divine guidance through Scripture. Joshua didn't waste time questioning his calling. He immediately stepped into his role as leader. Within days of receiving God's commission, he was giving orders to the officers of the people. As Joshua 1:10-11 records, "So Joshua ordered the officers of the people, 'Go through the camp and tell the people, get your provisions ready. 3 days from now, you will cross the Jordan here to go in and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you for your own.' 3 days. That's all the time he gave them to prepare for the moment they had been waiting for their entire lives. For 40 years, they had wandered in the wilderness. Now, in just 3 days, they would cross into their inheritance. The urgency in Joshua's voice must have been electric. But Joshua faced a potential problem. 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, had already received their inheritance on the east side of the Jordan. Moses had given them permission to settle there because the land was good for their livestock. Would they abandon their brothers now that they had what they wanted? Joshua addressed them directly in verses 12 through 15. But to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, "Remember the command that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you after he said, 'The Lord your God will give you rest by giving you this land. Your wives, your children, and your livestock may stay in the land that Moses gave you east of the Jordan, but all your fighting men, ready for battle, must cross over ahead of your fellow Israelites. You are to help them until the Lord gives them rest, as he has done for you, and until they too have taken possession of the land the Lord your God is giving them. After that you may go back and occupy your own land, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you east of the Jordan toward the sunrise." This was a test of unity. These tribes could have easily said, "We're settled. This isn't our fight anymore." But Joshua reminded them of their promise to Moses. They were still part of Israel. Their brother's victory was their responsibility too. The response was immediate and unanimous. In verses 16 through 18 they declared, "Then they answered Joshua, 'Whatever you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you, as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your command and does not obey it, whatever you may command them will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous.'" These weren't just polite words. This was a covenant of loyalty. They were pledging to follow Joshua with the same devotion they had shown Moses. More than that, they were declaring that rebellion against Joshua's leadership would be treated as rebellion against God himself. Joshua was a wise military leader. Before crossing the Jordan, he needed intelligence about what waited on the other side. So he made a decision that would change everything. As Joshua 2:1 tells us, "Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. 'Go look over the land,' he said, 'especially Jericho.' So they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there." The spies' mission was simple: scout the land, especially Jericho. This massive, fortified city stood directly in their path. Its walls were legendary, so thick that houses were built into them. If they could understand Jericho's defenses, they could plan their approach to the entire land. But God had a bigger plan. He led the spies to Rahab's house, and through her, he began to work a miracle. When the king of Jericho heard about the spies, he sent soldiers to capture them. But Rahab had already hidden them on her roof under stalks of flax. Her conversation with the king's men revealed something remarkable. As recorded in verses 8 through 11, she told the spies, "Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, 'I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below.'" This was intelligence beyond anything Joshua could have hoped for. The entire land was already afraid of them. Stories of God's mighty works had traveled ahead of the Israelite army. The psychological battle was already won. But Rahab wasn't finished. She made a request that would save her life and her family's lives. In verses 12 and 13 she said, "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." The spies agreed. They gave her a scarlet cord to hang from her window, a sign that would mark her house for protection when the army arrived. This wasn't just a military agreement. It was a covenant of salvation. Rahab's faith in Israel's God was about to be rewarded with life. The moment of truth had arrived. For 3 days the people had prepared. Now they stood at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to enter their inheritance. But there was a problem. It was harvest time, and the Jordan was at flood stage. The rushing waters were deeper and wider than usual. Joshua had a solution that would require complete faith. As Joshua 3:3-4 records, he gave these instructions. When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. The ark of the covenant would lead them. This sacred chest contained the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's staff, and a jar of manna. More importantly, it represented God's presence among his people. Where the ark went, God went. Joshua's faith was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. In verses 7 and 8, God told him, "And the Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river.'" Think about what God was asking. He wanted the priests to walk into a flooded river while carrying the most sacred object in Israel. There was no bridge, no boat, no visible way across, just a promise that God would make a way. Joshua gathered the people and explained God's plan. In verses 10 and 11 he declared, "This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you." The priests stepped forward. They walked to the water's edge with the ark on their shoulders. The moment their feet touched the water, the impossible happened. Verses 15 and 16 describe it. "Now the Jordan is at flood stage, all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of the Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests didn't move. They stood in the middle of the riverbed, holding the ark steady while all of Israel passed by on dry ground. It was a miracle that echoed Moses' parting of the Red Sea, but this time it was Joshua's faith that had opened the way. God never wanted his people to forget what he had done. As the last Israelite crossed the Jordan, he gave Joshua specific instructions about creating a permanent memorial. Joshua 4:1-3 records, "When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, 'Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight.' These weren't just any stones. They had to come from the exact spot where the priests had stood with the ark, the place where God had stopped the Jordan's flow. Each stone would represent one of the 12 tribes, and together they would tell the story of God's mighty power. Joshua called the 12 men and gave them their mission. In verses 5-7 he explained, "Joshua said to them, 'Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the Israelites forever." The stones weren't just for this generation. They were for the children who would come after, the ones who hadn't seen the miracle with their own eyes. When curious young voices would ask, "What do these stones mean?" their parents would have a story to tell. A story of the day God stopped a river and led his people home. But that wasn't the only memorial. Joshua also built a second monument in the riverbed itself. Verse 9 tells us, Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. 2 memorials. One at their camp in Gilgal, where they could see it every day. Another in the Jordan, hidden beneath the waters, known only to God and his people. Both declared the same message. The Lord your God did this, remember, never forget. The crossing was complete. As verse 19 records, on the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. They were finally in the promised land. The wilderness years were over. The conquest was about to begin. The news traveled fast. Word of what happened at the Jordan River spread throughout the land like wildfire. The Canaanite kings had heard stories about Israel's God before, but this was different. This was happening right next door. Joshua 5:1 captures the moment. Now, when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. Their hearts melted. These weren't weak men. They were seasoned warriors who had fought many battles. They ruled fortified cities and commanded armies. But something about Israel's God terrified them beyond reason. It wasn't just the miracle at the Jordan. The kings had been hearing stories for years. They knew about the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the victories over Sihon and Og. Each story had chipped away at their confidence. Now, with Israel camped just miles from their cities, fear had turned to panic. This wasn't an accident. God had been preparing the battlefield long before the first Israelite soldier crossed the Jordan. The terror in these kings' hearts was a weapon more powerful than any sword. When an enemy is already defeated in his mind, the physical battle is half won. The psychological impact was exactly what Israel needed. They were about to face their first real test in the Promised Land. Jericho loomed ahead, a massive fortress that had never been conquered. But the men inside those walls were already afraid. God's reputation had preceded his army, and that reputation was working in their favor. The stage was set for something extraordinary. The enemy kings knew they were facing more than just another nomadic tribe. They were facing the people of the God who controlled rivers, who had humbled the mighty nation of Egypt, who had led his people through 40 years in the wilderness. Their fear would become Israel's advantage. But before the conquest could begin, Israel had some unfinished business with God. During their 40 years in the wilderness, they had neglected an important covenant sign. The Lord spoke to Joshua in chapter 5, verse 2. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." An entire generation had grown up without being circumcised. This wasn't rebellion. It was simply the reality of wilderness life. But now, in the Promised Land, it was time to renew their covenant with God. Every male had to bear the sign that marked them as God's chosen people. Joshua obeyed immediately. Verses 3 and 4 tell us, "So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haraloth," which means hill of foreskins. Now this is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. This was a vulnerable moment for Israel. The entire army was recovering from surgery, unable to fight if attacked. But God had already taken care of that problem. The enemy kings were too afraid to approach. Divine protection covered them while they renewed their covenant. The circumcision had deeper meaning, as verse 9 explains. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. The name Gilgal means rolling. God had rolled away their shame, their past, their identity as slaves. The moment of truth had arrived. For 3 days the people had prepared. Now they stood at the banks of the Jordan River, ready to enter their inheritance. But there was a problem. It was harvest time, and the Jordan was at flood stage. The rushing waters were deeper and wider than usual. Joshua had a solution that would require complete faith. As Joshua 3:3-4 records, he gave these instructions. "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it." The ark of the covenant would lead them. This sacred chest contained the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, Aaron's staff, and a jar of manna. More importantly, it represented God's presence among his people. Where the ark went, God went. Joshua's faith was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. In verses 7 and 8, God told him, "And the Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I will begin to exalt you in the eyes of all Israel, so they may know that I am with you as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you reach the edge of the Jordan's waters, go and stand in the river.'" Think about what God was asking. He wanted the priests to walk into a flooded river while carrying the most sacred object in Israel. There was no bridge, no boat, no visible way across, just a promise that God would make a way. Joshua gathered the people and explained God's plan. In verses 10 and 11 he declared, "This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you." The priests stepped forward. They walked to the water's edge with the ark on their shoulders. The moment their feet touched the water, the impossible happened. Verses 15 and 16 describe it. "Now the Jordan is at flood stage, all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the Sea of the Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests didn't move. They stood in the middle of the riverbed, holding the ark steady while all of Israel passed by on dry ground. It was a miracle that echoed Moses' parting of the Red Sea, but this time it was Joshua's faith that had opened the way. God never wanted his people to forget what he had done. As the last Israelite crossed the Jordan, he gave Joshua specific instructions about creating a permanent memorial. Joshua 4:1-3 records, "When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, 'Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight.' These weren't just any stones. They had to come from the exact spot where the priests had stood with the ark, the place where God had stopped the Jordan's flow. Each stone would represent one of the 12 tribes, and together they would tell the story of God's mighty power. Joshua called the 12 men and gave them their mission. In verses 5-7 he explained, "Joshua said to them, 'Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, "What do these stones mean?" tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the Israelites forever. The stones weren't just for this generation. They were for the children who would come after, the ones who hadn't seen the miracle with their own eyes. When curious young voices would ask, "What do these stones mean?" their parents would have a story to tell, a story of the day God stopped a river and led his people home. But that wasn't the only memorial. Joshua also built a second monument in the riverbed itself. Verse 9 tells us, Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day. 2 memorials. One at their camp in Gilgal, where they could see it every day. Another in the Jordan, hidden beneath the waters, known only to God and his people. Both declared the same message. The Lord your God did this, remember, never forget. The crossing was complete. As verse 19 records, on the 10th day of the first month, the people went up from the Jordan and camped at Gilgal on the eastern border of Jericho. They were finally in the promised land. The wilderness years were over. The conquest was about to begin. The news traveled fast. Word of what happened at the Jordan River spread throughout the land like wildfire. The Canaanite kings had heard stories about Israel's God before, but this was different. This was happening right next door. Joshua 5:1 captures the moment. Now, when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. Their hearts melted. These weren't weak men. They were seasoned warriors who had fought many battles. They ruled fortified cities and commanded armies. But something about Israel's God terrified them beyond reason. It wasn't just the miracle at the Jordan. The kings had been hearing stories for years. They knew about the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, the victories over Sihon and Og. Each story had chipped away at their confidence. Now, with Israel camped just miles from their cities, fear had turned to panic. This wasn't an accident. God had been preparing the battlefield long before the first Israelite soldier crossed the Jordan. The terror in these kings' hearts was a weapon more powerful than any sword. When an enemy is already defeated in his mind, the physical battle is half won. The psychological impact was exactly what Israel needed. They were about to face their first real test in the Promised Land. Jericho loomed ahead, a massive fortress that had never been conquered. But the men inside those walls were already afraid. God's reputation had preceded his army, and that reputation was working in their favor. The stage was set for something extraordinary. The enemy kings knew they were facing more than just another nomadic tribe. They were facing the people of the God who controlled rivers, who had humbled the mighty nation of Egypt, who had led his people through 40 years in the wilderness. Their fear would become Israel's advantage. But before the conquest could begin, Israel had some unfinished business with God. During their 40 years in the wilderness, they had neglected an important covenant sign. The Lord spoke to Joshua in chapter 5, verse 2. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." An entire generation had grown up without being circumcised. This wasn't rebellion. It was simply the reality of wilderness life. But now, in the Promised Land, it was time to renew their covenant with God. Every male had to bear the sign that marked them as God's chosen people. Joshua obeyed immediately. Verses 3 and 4 tell us, "So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haraloth," which means hill of foreskins. Now this is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the wilderness on the way after leaving Egypt. This was a vulnerable moment for Israel. The entire army was recovering from surgery, unable to fight if attacked. But God had already taken care of that problem. The enemy kings were too afraid to approach. Divine protection covered them while they renewed their covenant. The circumcision had deeper meaning, as verse 9 explains. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day. The name Gilgal means rolling. God had rolled away their shame, their past, their identity as slaves. Joshua selected 30,000 fighting men for the mission. His plan was detailed. The main army would pretend to flee like before, luring Ai's forces away from the city, while the ambush force would capture the empty city. The strategy worked perfectly. When the king of Ai saw Joshua's army approaching, he confidently led his men out to fight. Joshua pretended to be defeated and ran toward the wilderness. The men of Ai chased eagerly, leaving their city defenseless. As verse 17 tells us, not a man remained in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. They left the city open and went in pursuit of Israel. At the perfect moment, Joshua signaled the ambush. Verse 18 records, "Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'Hold out toward Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city.' So Joshua held out toward the city the javelin that was in his hand. The ambush force captured Ai and set it on fire. When the men of Ai saw their city burning, they realized they were trapped. Verse 22 describes the complete rout. Those in the ambush also came out of the city against them, so that they were caught in the middle, with Israelites on both sides. Israel cut them down, leaving them neither survivors nor fugitives. Every soldier from Ai was killed. The king was captured and executed. The city was destroyed. But this time Israel kept the livestock and plunder. After the victories at Jericho and Ai, Joshua led the entire nation north to Mount Ebal. He had a sacred duty to fulfill that Moses had commanded. Joshua 8:30-31 tells us, "Then Joshua built on Mount Ebal an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the Israelites." He built it according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones, on which no iron tool had been used. On it they offered to the Lord burnt offerings and sacrificed fellowship offerings. This wasn't just any altar. It had to be built exactly as Moses had specified, made of stones that had never been touched by iron tools. But building the altar was only the beginning. Joshua gathered all of Israel for something extraordinary. Verse 34 describes what happened. Afterward, Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, just as it is written in the book of the law. And the entire law of Moses was read aloud to the assembled nation. Every commandment, every promise, every warning. The people stood in two groups, half facing Mount Gerizim for the blessings and half facing Mount Ebal for the curses. Verse 35 emphasizes how complete this ceremony was. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the foreigners who lived among them. Every single word. Nothing was left out. Everyone needed to understand what God expected and what would happen if they obeyed or disobeyed. This covenant renewal reminded Israel that their success depended on their relationship with God, not just military skill. Joshua had learned this lesson after Achan's sin, and he wasn't going to let his people forget it. While Joshua was conducting the covenant renewal ceremony at Mount Ebal, news of Israel's victories was spreading like wildfire throughout Canaan. The kings were starting to panic, but not everyone chose to fight. In the city of Gibeon, the leaders came up with a different plan, one that involved elaborate lies, clever tricks, and carefully prepared fake evidence. The Gibeonites were part of the Hivite people, and they knew they were marked for destruction according to God's command. They had heard about the miraculous fall of Jericho and the clever conquest of Ai, and they understood that Israel's God was too powerful to resist in battle. So they decided to try deception instead of resistance. Joshua 9:3-5 describes their elaborate and carefully planned scheme. However, when the people of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and to Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn and patched sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. They put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. Every single detail was carefully planned to support their false story. The old sacks, cracked wineskins, worn-out sandals, and moldy bread were all supposed to prove that they had traveled a very long distance to reach Israel. They wanted to look exactly like travelers who had come from a far country, not from a nearby city that was supposed to be destroyed. When the delegation reached Joshua at his camp in Gilgal, they put on quite a convincing performance. Verses 6-9 record their carefully rehearsed speech. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, "We have come from a distant country, make a treaty with us." The Israelites said to the Hivites, "But perhaps you live near us, so how can we make a treaty with you?" "We are your servants," they said to Joshua. But Joshua asked, "Who are you, and where do you come from?" They answered, "Your servants have come from a very distant land because of the fame of the Lord your God. For we have heard reports of him, all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, Sihon king of Heshbon, and Og king of Bashan, who reigned in Ashtaroth." Their story was not only clever, but also psychologically shrewd. They mentioned only the old victories that had happened before Israel crossed the Jordan, Egypt, Sihon, and Og, but nothing about the recent battles at Jericho or Ai. This was supposed to prove that they had left their distant homeland before those recent victories occurred. They even showed their moldy bread and worn-out equipment as physical evidence. In verses 12 and 13, they continued their deception. "This bread of ours was warm when we packed it at home on the day we left to come to you. But now see how dry and moldy it is. And these wineskins that we filled were new, but see how cracked they are. And our clothes and sandals are worn out by the very long journey." The deception worked perfectly. Joshua and the leaders of Israel examined all the evidence and concluded that the Gibeonites must be telling the truth, but they made a crucial mistake. Verse 14 reveals their critical error. The Israelites sampled their provisions but did not inquire of the Lord. After all the miracles they had witnessed, they made this important decision based entirely on human wisdom. They forgot to ask God for guidance. The treaty was signed quickly, and the oath was sworn before God. Once the oath was made, it couldn't be broken. 3 days later, the truth came out. Verse 16 tells us, 3 days after they made the treaty with the Gibeonites, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors, living near them. The Gibeonites weren't from a distant country at all. They lived right there in Canaan, in cities that were supposed to be destroyed. When Israel reached the Gibeonite cities, they were furious, but helpless. They couldn't attack because of the sacred treaty. Joshua confronted the Gibeonites about their deception. Their answer in verse 24 was honest about their motives. They answered Joshua, "Your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and to wipe out all its inhabitants from before you. So we feared for our lives because of you, and that is why we did this." They had lied because they were terrified. Joshua couldn't kill them because of the treaty, but he could punish them. Verse 27 describes their sentence. That day he made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly, to provide for the needs of the altar of the Lord at the place the Lord would choose. And that is what they are to this day. The Gibeonites became permanent servants to Israel. Their clever plan had saved their lives, but it had also made them slaves forever. The news of the Gibeonite treaty sent shockwaves throughout the rest of Canaan. If one city could make peace with Israel, others might follow. The Canaanite kings realized they needed to act fast to stop this dangerous trend. 5 powerful kings decided to join forces and teach the Gibeonites a lesson they would never forget. Joshua 10:3-5 describes the coalition. So Adoni-Zedek king of Jerusalem sent word to Hoham king of Hebron, Piram king of Jarmuth, Japhia king of Lachish, and Debir king of Eglon. "Come up and help me attack Gibeon," he said, "because it has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites." Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, joined forces. They moved up with all their troops and took up positions against Gibeon and attacked it. This was serious trouble for Gibeon. 5 armies had surrounded their city, and they were badly outnumbered. The Gibeonites sent an urgent message to Joshua at Gilgal, recorded in verse 6. The Gibeonites then sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, "Do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces against us." Joshua was faced with a dilemma. The Gibeonites had tricked him, but a treaty was still a treaty. He decided to honor the agreement. He gathered his entire army and marched all night from Gilgal to Gibeon. But before he left, God gave him a promise. Verse 8 records the Lord's words. "The Lord said to Joshua, 'Do not be afraid of them. I have given them into your hand. Not one of them will be able to withstand you.'" The surprise attack worked perfectly. Joshua's army arrived at dawn and caught the 5 kings completely off guard. As verse 10 describes, the Lord threw them into confusion before Israel, so Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely at Gibeon. Israel pursued them along the road going up to Beth Horon and cut them down all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. But God wasn't finished helping. As the enemy armies fled in panic, he sent supernatural reinforcements from the sky. Verse 11 tells us, as they fled before Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. Giant hailstones fell from heaven, targeting only the enemy soldiers while sparing the Israelites. It was a miracle that showed God's precise control over nature. But even this wasn't enough for Joshua. He wanted to finish the job completely, and daylight was running out. What Joshua did next was unprecedented in human history. Verse 12 records his bold prayer. "On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, 'Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon.'" Joshua commanded the sun and moon to stop moving. It was an incredible request, asking God to halt the rotation of the earth so that the battle could continue. But God honored his faith. Verses 13 and 14 describe what happened. "So the sun stood still and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jashar. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. The longest day in history had just happened. The sun stood still for almost 24 hours, giving Israel enough time to completely destroy their enemies. It was a miracle that demonstrated God's absolute power over creation and his willingness to intervene for his people. The 5-king coalition was wiped out. The hailstones and the extra daylight had made Israel's victory total and complete. The message was clear to every other Canaanite city. There was no point in fighting against Israel's God. He controlled the very heavens themselves. During the heat of battle, the 5 kings who had started this war realized they were facing disaster. As their armies crumbled under Israel's attack and God's hailstones, they tried to save themselves by running away and hiding. Joshua 10, 16, 17 tells us where they went. Now the 5 kings had fled and hidden in the cave at Makkedah. When Joshua was told that the 5 kings had been found hiding in the cave at Makkedah, he said, "Roll large rocks up to the mouth of the cave and post some men there to guard it." Joshua had more important things to do than deal with hiding kings. The battle was still raging, and he wanted to make sure none of the enemy soldiers escaped. So he sealed the cave with large rocks and left guards to watch it while he finished destroying the armies. His instructions to his soldiers were clear and urgent, as recorded in verses 18 and 19. But don't stop. Pursue your enemies. Attack them from the rear, and don't let them reach their cities, for the Lord your God has given them into your hand. There would be time to deal with the kings later. Right now, the priority was making sure their armies were completely eliminated. After the battle was won and the enemy forces were destroyed, Joshua returned to deal with the trapped kings. What happened next was both a military ceremony and a powerful message to all of Israel. Verses 22 through 24 describe the scene. Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me." So they brought the 5 kings out of the cave, the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. When they brought these kings to Joshua, he summoned all the men of Israel and said to the army commanders who had come with him, "Come here and put your feet on the necks of these kings." So they came forward and placed their feet on their necks. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. In ancient warfare, this was a symbolic act that showed complete victory over your enemies. The commanders who had fought bravely were being honored, and the defeated kings were being publicly humiliated. Joshua used this moment to teach his men an important lesson. His words in verse 25 were meant to encourage them for future battles. Joshua said to them, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Be strong and courageous. This is what the Lord will do to all the enemies you are going to fight." These 5 kings had seemed so powerful when they formed their coalition. They ruled major cities and commanded large armies. But now they were helpless prisoners, completely at Israel's mercy. Joshua wanted his commanders to remember this moment when they faced other enemies in future battles. The execution was swift and decisive. Verse 26 records, "Then Joshua put the kings to death and exposed their bodies on 5 poles, and they were left hanging on the poles until evening." The public display served as a warning to other Canaanite rulers about what happened to those who opposed Israel. At sunset, the bodies were taken down and thrown back into the cave where the kings had tried to hide. Large rocks were piled over the entrance, creating a permanent memorial. As verse 27 states, "At sunset, Joshua gave the order, and they took them down from the poles and threw them into the cave where they had been hiding. At the mouth of the cave, they placed large rocks, which are there to this day." The cave became a monument to God's victory. Travelers passing by would see the rocks and remember the day when 5 kings tried to destroy Gibeon and ended up destroying themselves instead. With the 5 kings dead and their armies destroyed, Joshua saw an opportunity he couldn't waste. The major cities of southern Canaan were now defenseless, their rulers dead and their soldiers eliminated. It was time to complete the conquest of the entire region while the cities were unable to resist. The first target was Makkedah itself, the city near the cave where the kings had hidden. Joshua 10:28 describes its swift capture. That day Joshua took Makkedah. He put the city and its king to the sword and totally destroyed everyone in it. He left no survivors, and he did to the king of Makkedah as he had done to the king of Jericho. There was no resistance. With their king dead and their army gone, Makkedah fell easily. The pattern was set for what would become a lightning campaign across the southern territories. Next came Libnah, another fortified city that might have taken weeks to conquer under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Verses 29 and 30 tell us, "Then Joshua and all Israel with him moved on from Makkedah to Libnah and attacked it. The Lord also gave that city and its king into Israel's hand. The city and everyone in it Joshua put to the sword. He left no survivors there, and he did to its king as he had done to the king of Jericho." The momentum was building. Each victory made the next one easier as word spread that resistance was useless. The cities were falling like dominoes, and Joshua's army was growing more confident with each success. Lachish was next, and this city tried to hold out longer than the others. But even their defiance couldn't last. Verses 31 and 32 describe the siege. "Then Joshua and all Israel with him moved on from Libnah to Lachish. He took up positions against it and attacked it. The Lord gave Lachish into Israel's hands, and Joshua took it on the second day. The city and everyone in it he put to the sword, just as he had done to Libnah. 2 days was all it took to capture a major Canaanite stronghold. The psychological impact of the earlier victories had broken the will to resist. But Lachish had one last surprise. Verse 33 tells us, "Meanwhile, Horam, king of Gezer, had come up to help Lachish, but Joshua defeated him and his army until no survivors were left. Even reinforcements couldn't save Lachish. King Horam and his entire army were wiped out." The campaign continued relentlessly. Eglon was captured in a single day. Verses 34 and 35 record, "Then Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Lachish to Eglon. They took up positions against it and attacked it. They captured it that same day and put it to the sword and totally destroyed everyone in it, just as they had done to Lachish. Then came Hebron, the ancient city where Abraham had lived." Verses 36 and 37 describe its fate. "Then Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Eglon to Hebron and attacked it. They took the city and put it to the sword, together with its king, its villages, and everyone in it. They left no survivors. Just as at Eglon, they totally destroyed it and everyone in it. Finally, Debir was conquered, completing the southern campaign." Verses 38 and 39 tell the story. "Then Joshua and all Israel with him turned around and attacked Debir. They took the city, its king and its villages, and put them to the sword. Everyone in it they totally destroyed. They left no survivors. They did to Debir and its king as they had done to Libnah and its king, and to Hebron." 7 major cities conquered in rapid succession. The entire southern region of Canaan was now under Israeli control. Joshua's summary shows how complete the victory was. Verses 40 through 42 give the final tally. "So Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with all their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua subdued them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, and from the whole region of Goshen to Gibeon. All these kings and their lands Joshua conquered in one campaign, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel." One campaign. In a matter of weeks, Joshua had conquered an entire region that should have taken years to subdue. The secret wasn't superior strategy or overwhelming numbers. It was divine intervention. The Lord God of Israel had fought for his people, and no human army could stand against him. The chapter ends with a simple statement. "Then Joshua returned with all Israel to the camp at Gilgal." The southern campaign was over, the region was conquered, and it was time to prepare for the next phase of God's plan. News of Israel's complete victory in the south spread quickly throughout northern Canaan. King Jabin of Hazor knew he had to act fast. Hazor was the most powerful city in the north, often called the head of all these kingdoms. If anyone could organize resistance against Israel, it would be him. Jabin began reaching out to every king in the north. His message was simple: unite now or be destroyed separately later. Joshua 11:1-2 describes how this massive coalition formed. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent word to Jobab, king of Madon, to the kings of Shimron and Akshaph, and to the northern kings who were in the mountains, in the Arabah south of Kinnereth, in the western foothills, and in Naphoth Dor on the west. This wasn't just a local alliance. Jabin was calling together kings from mountains, valleys, coastal regions, from every corner of northern Canaan. He understood this would be the last chance for organized resistance against Israel's advance. The response was overwhelming. Kings came from everywhere, bringing their armies. Verse 3 shows how broad this coalition became. They came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. The sight must have been incredible. Army after army streaming toward the waters of Merom. Chariots rolling across the landscape, horses thundering, weapons glinting in the sun. The dust clouds from all these moving forces would have been visible for miles. But it wasn't just the number of soldiers that made this coalition dangerous. Verse 4 reveals what made this army different. They came out with all their troops and a large number of horses and chariots, a huge army, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Horses and chariots were the ancient world's tanks and fighter jets. Israel had been fighting infantry armies with basic weapons. Now they faced cavalry units and armored vehicles. The technological advantage was completely on the enemy's side. The coalition gathered at the waters of Merom, a strategic location controlling major routes into northern Canaan. From there, they could strike at Israel from multiple directions or force Joshua to attack on ground of their choosing. Jabin must have felt confident looking over this massive force. He had united more kings than ever before. He had the largest army ever assembled in Canaan. He had superior weapons and tactical advantages. By every human measure, Israel faced impossible odds. When Joshua received reports about the massive enemy coalition at the waters of Merom, he must have been concerned. His scouts told him about the incredible army size, the horses and chariots, the strategic position. This was unlike anything Israel had faced before. But God wasn't worried about horses, chariots, or large armies. He had promised to give Israel the entire land, and that promise included the north. Before Joshua could become anxious about the overwhelming odds, the Lord spoke with words of comfort and specific instructions. Joshua 11:6 records God's reassuring message. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, because by this time tomorrow I will hand all of them, slain, over to Israel. You are to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." God's promise was specific and encouraging. By this time tomorrow, the entire coalition would be defeated, not just beaten back, but completely destroyed. The timing was precise. 24 hours from now, this massive threat would be eliminated. God also gave Joshua unusual instructions about the horses and chariots after victory. Instead of keeping these valuable military assets, they were to be destroyed. The horses were to be hamstrung, making them unable for warfare, and the chariots burned. This command revealed something important about God's plan for Israel. They weren't supposed to rely on superior weapons or military technology for victories. Their strength was to come from the Lord alone, not from horses and chariots like other nations. Joshua didn't hesitate or ask questions about these instructions. He had learned to trust God's commands completely, even when they seemed strange militarily. The same God who made Jericho's walls fall and stopped the sun over Gibeon was now promising victory over this northern coalition. The instructions to destroy the horses and chariots served a practical purpose. If Israel kept these weapons, it might tempt them to rely on military might rather than divine power in future battles. It would also prevent captured equipment from being recaptured and used against them later. Joshua began making battle plans based on God's promise. He wouldn't wait for the enemy to attack or find a defensive position. Instead, he would strike first and hard. The element of surprise would be crucial against such a large force. Verse 7 describes Joshua's response. So Joshua and his whole army came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them. There was no lengthy preparation, no complex maneuvering, no attempt to match enemy numbers, just a swift, decisive assault based entirely on God's promise. The attack caught the coalition completely off guard. They expected Israel to approach cautiously, not launch an immediate assault against overwhelming numbers. But that's exactly what made the strategy so effective. The battle at the waters of Merom was swift and devastating. Just as God promised, the massive northern coalition was completely destroyed within 24 hours. The horses and chariots that seemed so intimidating proved useless against divine intervention. As enemy forces fled in panic, Joshua pursued them relentlessly. But his main target wasn't just the armies, it was the cities they came from, especially Hazor, the head of all these kingdoms. If he could capture and destroy Hazor, it would send a clear message that no city could stand against Israel. Hazor was an impressive target. It was one of the largest cities in ancient Canaan, covering over 200 acres and housing perhaps 40,000 people. Its walls were massive, its defenses strong, and it had been the dominant northern power for centuries. But none of that mattered when facing Israel's God. Joshua 11:10-11 describes what happened to this great city. At that time, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all these kingdoms. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed, and he burned Hazor itself. The destruction was complete and systematic. The king who tried to organize resistance was killed. Every person in the city was eliminated according to God's command. And then the city itself was burned to the ground, something Joshua didn't do to every conquered city. The burning of Hazor was particularly significant. This wasn't just about destroying a military target, it was about eliminating the center of Canaanite power in the north. Hazor had been where kings gathered, policies were made, resistance organized. By burning it completely, Joshua ensured it could never again serve as a rallying point for Israel's enemies. But Joshua didn't stop with Hazor. He systematically attacked every city that had been part of the coalition. Verse 12 tells us, Joshua took all these royal cities and their kings and put them to the sword. He totally destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. This was methodical warfare designed to eliminate organized resistance permanently. Each king who joined the coalition was killed. Each city that sent troops was captured. Each center of power was dismantled. Joshua was ensuring that the northern territories could never again mount effective opposition. The reference to Moses' commands is important. Joshua wasn't acting on personal initiative or cruelty. He was carefully following instructions that God had given through Moses about conducting warfare in the Promised Land. These weren't arbitrary acts of violence, but obedience to divine commands. Verse 15 summarizes this obedience. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. Joshua was proving himself a faithful successor to Moses, not just in military leadership, but in spiritual obedience. Every command was followed, every instruction obeyed, every detail attended to. The conquest of the north wasn't just a military campaign, it was an act of worship through complete obedience. While individual battles often seem to happen quickly, the overall campaign took much longer than many realize. The victories at Jericho, Ai, and the Northern Coalition might give the impression that Israel conquered the entire land in just a few months. But the reality was quite different. Joshua 11:18 reveals the true timeline. Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. This wasn't a brief campaign that wrapped up in a single season. It was an extended military operation that continued for years, requiring persistent effort and sustained commitment. The phrase, "a long time," indicates the conquest was a gradual process of consolidating control over territory, eliminating pockets of resistance, and establishing Israeli authority throughout the land. Some cities fell quickly, others required lengthy sieges, and some areas needed multiple campaigns to secure completely. The scope of Joshua's conquests was impressive in its geographical extent. Verse 16 describes the territories under Israeli control. So Joshua took this entire land, the hill country, all the Negev, the whole region of Goshen, the western foothills, the Arabah, and the mountains of Israel with their foothills. This represented virtually every type of terrain and climate in the Promised Land. From the desert regions of the Negev in the south to mountainous areas in the north, from coastal plains in the west to the Jordan Valley in the east, Israel had established control over the entire country. The comprehensive nature of these conquests is emphasized in verse 17. From Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir, to Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon, he captured all their kings and put them to death. Dim, these geographical markers show Joshua's campaigns extended from the far south near Edom to the far north near the Jordan River sources. It was a complete conquest that left no major region unconquered and no significant enemy leader alive. One remarkable aspect was the elimination of the Anakim, the giants who had terrified the original spies 40 years earlier. Verses 21 to 22 describe this achievement. At that time, Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua totally destroyed them and their towns. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. The Anakim had been the source of the spies' fear when they first scouted the land. These giants had seemed so intimidating that 10 of 12 spies convinced the people that conquest was impossible. But now, under Joshua's leadership, even these fearsome enemies were completely eliminated from most of the land. The systematic nature of conquest meant resistance was broken not just militarily, but psychologically. Verse 20 explains God's role. For it was the Lord himself who hardened their hearts to wage war against Israel, so that he might destroy them totally, sparing them no mercy, as the Lord had commanded Moses. God had hardened the hearts of Canaanite peoples, making them fight rather than surrender or flee. This ensured they would be eliminated completely, rather than remaining as potential future problems. It was a divine strategy that guaranteed the thoroughness of conquest. The end result was exactly what God had promised from the beginning. Verse 23 summarizes the achievement. So Joshua took the entire land, just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. The long years of warfare were finally over. The extended campaigns had achieved their purpose. The entire Promised Land was now under Israeli control, ready to be divided among the tribes as their permanent inheritance. Before Joshua's western conquests began, important victories had already been won east of the Jordan River. These earlier battles, fought under Moses' leadership, established the pattern for what would happen in the Promised Land proper. They also provided inheritance for 2.5 tribes who chose to settle in that region. Joshua 12:1 sets the stage for remembering these eastern victories. These are the kings of the land whom the Israelites had defeated and whose territory they took over east of the Jordan, from the Arnon Gorge to Mount Hermon, including all the eastern side of the Arabah. This geographical description shows the extent of territories conquered under Moses. From the Arnon Gorge in the south near the Dead Sea to Mount Hermon in the far north, Israel had gained control of a substantial region east of the Jordan River. This area was fertile, well-watered, and ideal for raising livestock. The first major victory had been against Sihon, king of the Amorites. Verses 2-3 describe his kingdom, Sihon, king of the Amorites, who reigned in Heshbon. He ruled from Aroer on the rim of the Arnon Gorge, from the middle of the gorge to the Jabbok River, which is the border of the Ammonites. This included half of Gilead. He also ruled over the eastern Arabah, from the Sea of Galilee to the Sea of the Arabah, that is, the Dead Sea, to Beth Jeshemoth, and then southward below the slopes of Pisgah. Sihon's kingdom was strategically important because it controlled key trade routes and provided access to Jordan River crossings. When Moses requested peaceful passage through this territory, Sihon refused and attacked Israel instead. That decision proved fatal. The defeat of Sihon opened the way for Israel's approach to the Promised Land and gave them confidence that God would fight for them against seemingly impossible odds. It also provided valuable experience in conducting warfare in the region. The second major eastern victory was against an even more formidable opponent. Verses 4-5 describe the kingdom of Og and the territory of Og, king of Bashan, one of the last of the Rephaites, who reigned in Ashtaroth and Edrei. He ruled over Mount Hermon, Salekah, all of Bashan to the border of the people of Geshur and Makkah, and half of Gilead to the border of Sihon, king of Heshbon. Og was one of the last of the Rephaites, a race of giants similar to the Anakim. His kingdom of Bashan was known for its fertile soil, strong cities, and powerful military forces. The fact that Israel defeated such a formidable enemy gave them tremendous confidence for future battles. Verse 6 summarizes what happened to these conquered territories. Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the Israelites conquered them. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave their land to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh to be their possession. These eastern conquests weren't just military victories. They were the foundation for the settlement of 2.5 tribes. The territories of Sihon and Og became the inheritance of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, providing them with excellent land for their large herds and flocks. The reference to Moses as the servant of the Lord appears twice, emphasizing that these victories were accomplished through divine power, not human strength. Moses had been God's instrument for achieving these conquests, just as Joshua would be for the Western campaigns. The victories west of the Jordan River under Joshua's leadership were even more extensive than the eastern conquests under Moses. City after city fell to Israel's advancing army, and king after king was defeated and killed. The systematic nature of these conquests demonstrates both the thoroughness of the military campaign and the faithfulness of God's promises. Joshua 12:7-8 introduces the comprehensive list of Western victories. Here is a list of the kings of the land that Joshua and the Israelites conquered on the west side of the Jordan, from Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon to Mount Halak, which rises towards Seir. Joshua gave their lands as an inheritance to the tribes of Israel according to their tribal divisions. This introduction shows the geographical scope of Joshua's conquests, from the far north to the deep south, and lists the various peoples who had been defeated. Every major group that had occupied the Promised Land was now under Israeli control or had been eliminated entirely. The list that follows is remarkable for its length and detail. Verses 9-24 provide the names of 31 kings who were conquered during the Western campaigns. Each name represents not just a military victory, but the elimination of a center of resistance and the capture of strategic territory. The list begins with the most famous victories. The king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, near Bethel, 1. The king of Jerusalem, 1. The king of Hebron, 1. The king of Jarmuth, 1. the king of Lachish, 1. The king of Eglon, 1. The king of Gezer, 1. The king of Debir, 1. These names bring back memories of the major battles and campaigns we've already learned about. Jericho, with its falling walls, Ai, with its clever ambush strategy, the 5 kings who hid in the cave, the rapid southern campaign. All are represented in this catalogue of conquest. The list continues with many names that haven't appeared in the detailed battle narratives, showing that the conquest involved many more battles and victories than the detailed accounts describe. For every major campaign that gets full narrative treatment, there were numerous smaller actions that eliminated local resistance and secured strategic locations. The northern victories are well represented. The king of Shimron-Meron, 1. The king of Akshaph, 1. The king of Taanach, 1. The king of Megiddo, 1. The king of Kadesh, 1. The king of Jokneam in Carmel, 1. Some of these cities, like Megiddo and Taanach, would become famous in later Israeli history as important fortress cities controlling major trade routes. Their conquest under Joshua established Israeli control over these strategic locations from the very beginning. The final summary is impressive: 31 kings in all. Each king represented an independent city-state with its own army, fortifications, and sphere of influence. The fact that all 31 were defeated shows the completeness of Joshua's military success. This catalogue serves several important purposes. First, it provides a permanent record of God's faithfulness in giving Israel victory over every enemy. Second, it demonstrates the systematic nature of the conquest, showing that no significant center of resistance was left unconquered. Third, it establishes the legal basis for Israel's claim to the entire land. Despite the impressive catalogue of victories and the systematic nature of the conquest, not every part of the Promised Land was under Israeli control when the major military campaigns ended. As Joshua grew older, God spoke to him about the realities of the situation and the work that still remained. Joshua 13:1 sets the context. When Joshua had grown old, the Lord said to him, "You are now very old, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over." This wasn't a criticism of Joshua's leadership or military effectiveness. Rather, it was a realistic assessment of what had been accomplished and what still needed to be done. The phrase, "very large areas," indicates that the unconquered territories weren't just small pockets of resistance or isolated strongholds. These were substantial regions that would require significant military effort to bring under Israeli control. The conquest, though extensive, was still incomplete. God then provided a detailed description of what remained unconquered. Verses 2-5 list these territories. This is the land that remains, all the regions of the Philistines and Geshurites, from the Shihor River on the east of Egypt to the territory of Ekron on the north, all of it counted as Canaanite, though held by the 5 Philistine rulers in Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. Indeed, the Philistine territories along the Mediterranean coast represented some of the most challenging areas that Israel would face. These people had superior military technology, including iron weapons and war chariots, and they controlled important trade routes and coastal cities. Their 5 major cities would remain thorns in Israel's side for centuries. The northern territories around Lebanon also remained outside Israeli control. These mountainous regions were difficult to conquer and were inhabited by peoples with strong military traditions and well-fortified cities. But God's acknowledgement of these unconquered territories came with a promise and a plan. Verse 6 provides divine assurance. As for all the inhabitants of the mountain regions from Lebanon to Misrephoth-Maim, that is, all the Sidonians, I myself will drive them out before the Israelites. Be sure to allocate this land to Israel for an inheritance, as I have instructed you. God wasn't abandoning the promise to give Israel the entire land. Instead, he was explaining that the conquest would be a gradual process that would continue beyond Joshua's lifetime. The divine promise remained firm. These territories would eventually come under Israeli control. The instruction to allocate the unconquered territories as inheritance was significant. Even though Israel didn't physically control these areas yet, God wanted them assigned to specific tribes. This showed faith in the eventual fulfillment of the promise and gave each tribe a stake in completing the conquest of their assigned regions. Verse 7 provides the practical instruction, and divide it as an inheritance among the 9 tribes and half of the tribe of Manasseh. The land division would proceed based on divine promise rather than current military control. The tribes would receive their inheritances by faith, trusting God to help them complete the conquest of their territories. Before the Western territories could be divided among the 9.5 tribes, it was important to formally recognize the inheritance that had already been given to the 2.5 tribes east of the Jordan River. These tribes had received their portions under Moses' leadership, but their boundaries needed to be clearly defined and officially recorded. Joshua 13:8 introduces this section. The other half of Manasseh, the Reubenites and the Gadites, had received the inheritance that Moses had given them east of the Jordan, as he, the servant of the Lord, had assigned it to them. This reference to Moses emphasizes the legitimacy and divine authority behind these eastern allotments. The territory of Reuben was described in detail. Verses 15-21 provide the boundaries, showing that Reuben received the southern portion of the conquered territory east of the Jordan. It included much of the former kingdom of Sihon, with its capital city of Heshbon and its productive agricultural areas. The territory of Gad was described next. Verses 24-28 outline their inheritance, showing that Gad received the central portion of the eastern territories, including much of the fertile region of Gilead. This area was particularly well suited for raising livestock, which was exactly what the tribe of Gad needed. The half-tribe of Manasseh received the northern portion. Verses 29-31 describe their territory, including most of the former kingdom of Og. This northern region included the fertile plateau of Bashan, known for its cattle and grain production. The mention of 60 towns shows that this was a heavily settled and economically productive area. An important exclusion is mentioned in verse 33. But to the tribe of Levi, Moses had given no inheritance. The Lord, the God of Israel, is their inheritance as he promised them. The Levites were different from all the other tribes. Instead of receiving a specific territory to control and develop, they were given the privilege of serving God directly. The Levites' inheritance was spiritual rather than geographical. They would receive cities scattered throughout all the tribal territories, along with pasture lands for their livestock. But their primary calling was to serve at the tabernacle and later the temple, to teach God's law to the people, and to maintain the spiritual life of the nation. This arrangement ensured that every tribe would have Levites living among them to provide religious instruction and leadership. It also prevented the Levites from becoming too focused on territorial concerns that might distract them from their spiritual responsibilities. The detailed recording of these Eastern inheritances served several purposes. It provided legal documentation of tribal boundaries, it honored the commitments that Moses had made, and it demonstrated God's faithfulness in providing inheritance for his people. The precision of these boundary descriptions shows the importance that God places on clear agreements and proper administration. The time had come for the most important administrative task in Israel's history. The wars were over, the enemies were defeated, and the land was ready to be divided among the tribes. This wasn't just about drawing lines on a map. This was about fulfilling God's ancient promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The process took place at Gilgal, the same place where Israel had first camped after crossing the Jordan River. It was fitting that the land distribution would happen at this sacred location, where they had renewed their covenant with God and prepared for the conquest. Three key leaders oversaw this crucial process. Joshua 14:1 introduces them. Now these are the areas the Israelites received as an inheritance in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the tribal clans of Israel allotted to them. Eleazar the priest represented God's spiritual authority in the process. As the high priest, he would seek divine guidance through the sacred lots. Joshua brought his military expertise and overall leadership to ensure fair distribution. The tribal heads represented their people's interests and helped resolve any disputes that might arise. This wasn't a human decision-making process. God himself would determine which tribe received which territory. The method was clearly established, as described in verse 2. Their inheritances were assigned by lot to the 9.5 tribes, as the Lord had commanded through Moses. The casting of lots was a sacred practice that allowed God to make the decisions. Small stones or wooden pieces marked with tribal names would be placed in a container and drawn out randomly. But the Israelites understood that nothing was truly random when God was involved. He controlled even the way the lots fell. This method ensured that no tribe could complain about favoritism or unfair treatment. The assignments came from God, not from human preferences or political maneuvering. It also meant that each tribe would receive exactly what God intended for them, whether it seemed advantageous or challenging. The reference to 9.5 tribes reminds us of something important. Verse 3 explains, Moses had granted the 2.5 tribes their inheritance east of the Jordan, but had not granted the Levites an inheritance among the rest. The eastern tribes were already settled, and the Levites would receive a different kind of inheritance. But there was still the question of numbers. Verse 4 provides the answer, for Joseph's descendants had become 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim. The Levites received no share of the land, but only towns to live in, with pasture lands for their flocks and herds. Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, had each become full tribes in their own right. This fulfilled Jacob's ancient blessing when he adopted these boys as his own sons. So even without Levi receiving territory, there were still 12 portions to distribute among the remaining tribes. The process was designed to be both fair and final. Verse 5 concludes, So the Israelites divided the land just as the Lord had commanded Moses. There would be no appeals, no second-guessing, no redistributions. What God decided through the lots would stand forever. Before the formal lot casting began, there was one special case that needed to be addressed. An 85-year-old man approached Joshua with a request that would remind everyone of God's faithfulness across the decades. Caleb, son of Jephunneh, had been waiting 45 years for this moment. He was one of the 12 spies who had scouted the Promised Land when Israel first arrived at its borders, while 10 spies had brought back fearful reports about giants and fortified cities. Caleb and Joshua had urged the people to trust God and attack immediately. Now, decades later, Caleb was ready to claim what Moses had promised him. Joshua 14:6-7 records his approach. Now the people of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land, and I brought him back a report according to my convictions. Caleb's words were carefully chosen. He reminded Joshua of that crucial moment at Kadesh Barnea when their minority report had been overwhelmed by the majority's fear. Both men had paid a price for their faithfulness. They had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, along with everyone else, even though they had wanted to enter the land immediately. The old warrior continued his speech with remarkable confidence. Verses 8-9 reveal his unwavering faith. But my fellow Israelites who went up with me made the hearts of the people melt in fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. So on that day Moses swore to me, 'The land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly.'" Caleb's faith hadn't wavered in 45 years. The same confidence that had made him want to attack the giants immediately was still burning strong in his heart. Moses had promised him the specific territory he had scouted, and now he was ready to claim it. But Caleb wasn't finished with his remarkable speech. Verses 10 to 11 contain some of the most inspiring words in the entire Bible. "Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses, while Israel moved about in the wilderness. So here I am today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as the day Moses sent me out. I'm just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. 85 years old and still ready for battle. This wasn't an old man asking for a comfortable retirement village. This was a warrior requesting permission to fight the most dangerous enemies in the most challenging territory. Caleb's faith in God's strength had kept him young in spirit and strong in body. His specific request was bold beyond imagination. Verse 12 reveals what he wanted. "Now give me this hill country that the Lord promised me that day. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities were large and fortified. But the Lord helping me, I will drive them out, just as he said." The hill country around Hebron was where the Anakim lived, the giants who had terrified the other spies 45 years earlier. These were the same enemies who had made grown men tremble with fear. But Caleb wanted to fight them personally, trusting God to give him victory just as he had promised. Joshua must have smiled as he listened to his old friend's request. Here was the same faith, the same courage, the same trust in God that had sustained them both through 4 decades of waiting. Without hesitation, he granted Caleb's request. Verses 13 to 14 record the outcome. Then Joshua blessed Caleb son of Jephunneh and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. Caleb received exactly what he had been promised. The territory he had scouted as a 40-year-old spy became his inheritance as an 85-year-old warrior. God's faithfulness had bridged the gap between promise and fulfillment, between hope and reality. After Caleb's special inheritance was settled, the formal process of land distribution began. The first lot drawn belonged to the tribe of Judah, the largest and most influential tribe in Israel. Their territory would be extensive and strategically important, stretching across much of southern Canaan. The boundaries of Judah's inheritance were described with remarkable precision. This wasn't a vague assignment of general regions. It was a detailed legal document that established exact borders and prevented future disputes between tribes. The southern boundary was described first. Joshua 15:1-4 provides the details. The allotment for the tribe of Judah, according to its clans, extended down to the territory of Edom, to the desert of Zin in the extreme south. Their southern boundary started from the bay at the southern end of the Dead Sea, crossed south of Scorpion Pass, continued on to Zin, and went over to the south of Kadesh Barnea. Then it ran past Hezron up to Adar, and curved around to Karka. It then passed along to Asmon and joined the Wadi of Egypt, ending at the Mediterranean Sea. This southern border stretched from the Dead Sea in the east all the way to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. It included some of the most challenging terrain in the entire land, desert regions that required skill and determination to inhabit successfully. But it also included some of the most historically significant locations in Israel's journey. Kadesh Barnea, mentioned in the boundary description, was where the original spies had brought their report 45 years earlier. It was where Israel had made the fateful decision to reject God's command to enter the land immediately. Now, this historic location marked the southern edge of Judah's inheritance, a reminder of both failure and eventual triumph. The eastern boundary was simpler to describe. Verse 5 states, "The eastern boundary is the Dead Sea as far as the mouth of the Jordan." The northern boundary started from the Bay of the Sea at the mouth of the Jordan. The Dead Sea provided a clear, unmistakable border that would never change or shift. The northern boundary was more complex, involving numerous landmarks and geographical features. Verses 5 to 9 trace this border in detail, passing very close to Jerusalem, which at this time was still occupied by the Jebusites. The boundary description shows that Jerusalem was technically within Judah's territory, even though they hadn't yet conquered it. The western boundary was the most straightforward of all. Verse 12 simply states, "The western boundary is the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. These are the boundaries around the people of Judah by their clans." The Mediterranean Sea provided a natural western border that was easy to identify and impossible to dispute. This gave Judah access to coastal trade routes and fishing opportunities, adding to the economic potential of their territory. The precision of these boundary descriptions shows how seriously God took the matter of tribal inheritances. Every hill, every valley, every stream and spring was carefully noted. There would be no ambiguity about where one tribe's territory ended and another's began. While the overall boundaries of Judah's territory had been established by lot, there were special arrangements within those boundaries that needed to be addressed. These involved personal promises and family situations that required individual attention. The first special case was Caleb's inheritance, which had already been promised by Moses decades earlier. Joshua 15:13 records how this was handled. In accordance with the Lord's command to him, Joshua gave to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, a portion in Judah, Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron. Arba was the forefather of Anak. Caleb wasted no time in claiming his inheritance. At 85 years old, he immediately launched a military campaign against the giants who had terrorized the previous generation. Verse 14 describes his success. From Hebron, Caleb drove out the 3 Anakites, Sheshai, Ahimai, and Talmai, the sons of Anak. But Caleb wasn't satisfied with just securing Hebron. He had his eye on another important city that needed to be conquered. Verse 15 tells us, "From there he marched against the people living in Debir, formerly called Kiriath Sepher." Caleb decided to use this campaign as an opportunity to find a husband for his daughter. His announcement in verse 16 was both practical and clever. And Caleb said, "I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sepher." The challenge was accepted by Caleb's nephew. Verse 17 records, "Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's brother, took it, so Caleb gave his daughter Achsah to him in marriage." Othniel proved himself worthy of both the military challenge and the family connection. He would later become the first judge of Israel, showing that Caleb's evaluation of his character was accurate. But the story doesn't end with the wedding. Achsah proved to be as bold and practical as her father. Verse 18 describes what happened. "One day, when she came to Othniel, she urged him to ask her father for a field. When she got off her donkey, Caleb asked her, 'What can I do for you?' Achsah had noticed that their inheritance, while valuable, lacked something essential for agricultural success. Her request in verse 19 was both respectful and direct. She replied, 'Do me a special favor. Since you have given me land in the Negev, give me also springs of water.' So Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs. Water was life in the ancient Middle East, especially in the semi-arid Negev region. Achsah understood that land without reliable water sources would be difficult to farm and develop. Her request showed practical wisdom and long-term thinking. Caleb's response revealed the kind of father he was. He didn't just give his daughter one spring, He gave her both the upper and lower springs, ensuring that she and Othniel would have abundant water for their crops and livestock. It was a generous gift that showed his love for his daughter and his confidence in her judgment. After the boundaries and special inheritances were settled, the detailed assignment of cities within Judah's territory began. This wasn't just about major population centers, it included towns, villages, and settlements throughout the entire region. The cities were organized by geographical regions to make administration easier. Joshua 15:21-32 lists the cities in the southern Negev region. The southernmost towns of the tribe of Judah in the Negev toward the boundary of Edom were Kabzeel, Eder, Jagur, Kina, Dimona, Adada, Kadesh, Hazor, Ithnan, Ziph, Telem, Beloth, Hazor Hadatta, Kerioth Hezron, that is Hazor, Amam, Shema, Molada, Hazar Gada, Heshmon, Beth Pelet, Hazar Shual, Beersheba, Biziothia, Bala, Iyim, Ezem, Eltolad, Kesil, Horma, Ziklag, Madmana, Sansana, Lebaoth, Shilhim, Ain, and Rimmon, a total of 29 towns and their villages. This comprehensive list shows the extent of Judah's inheritance in the challenging southern region. 29 towns with their surrounding villages represented a substantial population and significant agricultural potential, even in the relatively harsh Negev environment. The western foothills, or Shephelah, contained another group of important cities. These cities controlled the approaches between the coastal plain and the hill country. They were strategically positioned to defend against attacks from the Philistine territories and to control trade routes between different regions. Additional cities in the foothills and hill country were listed with careful organization and totaling to ensure accurate record-keeping. The attention to detail shows how seriously the tribal leaders took their responsibility for proper land administration. But the extensive lists also revealed an important limitation. Not every city within Judah's assigned territory was actually under their control. The most significant example was mentioned in verse 63. Judah could not dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the people of Judah. Jerusalem was supposed to be part of Judah's inheritance, but the tribe had been unable to conquer it. The Jebusites had strong fortifications and a strategic position that made their city very difficult to capture. So they continued to live alongside the Israelites in an uneasy coexistence. This failure to completely conquer Jerusalem would have long-term consequences for Israel's history. The city remained a foreign stronghold in the heart of the Promised Land for several centuries, until David finally captured it and made it his capital. The presence of unconquered Canaanites also created opportunities for religious and cultural compromise. The phrase, "to this day," indicates that this situation persisted for a considerable time after the initial conquest. It serves as a reminder that receiving an inheritance from God doesn't automatically mean that all challenges disappear. The tribe still needed to demonstrate faith and courage to fully possess what God had given them. Despite the incomplete conquest of some areas, Judah's inheritance was substantial and valuable. The tribe received territory that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, from the wilderness borders in the south to the hill country in the north. The descendants of Joseph, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, received the next major territorial assignment. These two tribes held a special place in Israel's history because their ancestor had been Jacob's favorite son, and Jacob had personally blessed Joseph's sons before his death. The territory assigned to Joseph's descendants was located in the central hill country, some of the most fertile and strategically important land in all of Canaan. Joshua 16:1-3 describes the southern boundary of this inheritance. The allotment for Joseph began at the Jordan, east of the waters of Jericho, and went up from there through the desert into the hill country of Bethel. It went on from Bethel, that is Luz, to the territory of the Arkites in Ataroth. Then it descended westward to the territory of the Japhletites as far as the region of Lower Beth Horon and on to Gezer, ending at the Mediterranean Sea. This boundary description shows that Joseph's descendants controlled key routes between the Jordan Valley and the Mediterranean coast. The territory included important cities like Bethel, which would become a significant religious center in later Israelite history. Within this general inheritance, Ephraim received the southern portion. Their territory was compact but extremely valuable. It included some of the best agricultural land in the country and controlled important crossroads between north and south, east and west. The tribe would later produce Joshua himself, as well as other significant leaders in Israel's history. However, like Judah, Ephraim faced challenges in completely conquering their territory. Joshua 16:10 reveals a significant limitation. They did not dislodge the Canaanites living in Gezer. To this day, the Canaanites live among the people of Ephraim, but are required to do forced labor. The failure to completely eliminate the Canaanites from Gezer represented a compromise that would have negative consequences later. While forcing the Canaanites into labor service seemed like a practical solution, it also meant that pagan influences remained within Ephraim's territory. Manasseh, the other half of Joseph's descendants, received territory both east and west of the Jordan River. The eastern portion had been given under Moses' leadership, but now they also received western territory. But Manasseh's inheritance included an unusual situation involving women's inheritance rights. Verses 3 to 4 of chapter 17 describe this special case. Now Zelophehad, son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, had no sons but only daughters, whose names were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They went to Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the leaders and said, "The Lord commanded Moses to give us an inheritance among our relatives." So Joshua gave them an inheritance along with the brothers of their father, according to the Lord's command. This case had been decided earlier, when Moses was still alive, but now it needed to be implemented in the actual land distribution. The daughters of Zelophehad had successfully argued that they should inherit their father's portion, since he had no sons. This precedent established important principles about women's property rights. Despite receiving substantial territory, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh weren't satisfied with their inheritance. Joshua 17:14 records their complaint. The people of Joseph said to Joshua, "Why have you given us only one allotment and one portion for an inheritance? We are a numerous people, and the Lord has blessed us abundantly." Their complaint reveals both ingratitude and lack of faith. They had received some of the best land in the entire country, but they wanted more. Instead of being thankful for God's provision, they were focused on what they thought they deserved based on their numbers. Joshua's response was both practical and challenging. He told them that if they wanted more land, they should go take it. God had given them the ability and the promise. They just needed the faith and effort to claim it. The forested areas could be cleared and developed, and even the iron chariots of the Canaanites weren't too powerful for God to overcome. This exchange reveals an important principle about God's blessings. He provides what we need, but He often expects us to work to develop and expand what He has given us. After Judah, Ephraim, and Manasseh had received their inheritances, 7 tribes still needed their territorial assignments. But something troubling was happening. These remaining tribes were showing reluctance to claim their inheritances and settle down. The entire congregation moved from Gilgal to a new location that would become the religious center of Israel. Joshua 18:1 records this important transition. The whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The country was brought under their control. Shiloh became the central sanctuary where the tabernacle would remain for several centuries. This location in the hill country of Ephraim was more centrally positioned than Gilgal had been, making it accessible to all the tribes. The phrase, "the country was brought under their control," indicates that the major military campaigns were over, and it was time to focus on settlement and administration. But Joshua noticed a problem with the 7 remaining tribes. Verse 3 reveals his concern. So Joshua said to the Israelites, "How long will you wait before you begin to take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?" The tribes were hesitating to claim their inheritances. Perhaps they had grown comfortable with military life and weren't ready to settle down to farming and civilian responsibilities. Maybe they were intimidated by the work involved in clearing land and building cities. Joshua decided to take decisive action to move the process forward. His solution was both practical and fair, a comprehensive survey of the remaining territory that would provide detailed information for making informed assignments. Verses 4 to 6 describe Joshua's plan. "Appoint 3 men from each tribe. I will send them out to make a survey of the land and to write a description of it according to the inheritance of each. Then they will return to me. You are to divide the land into 7 parts. Judah is to remain in its territory on the south, and the tribes of Joseph in their territory on the north. After you have written descriptions of the 7 parts of the land, bring them here to me, and I will cast lots for you in the presence of the Lord our God." This survey expedition was remarkably sophisticated for its time. 21 men, 3 from each of the 7 tribes, would travel throughout the unconquered territories, mapping boundaries, identifying cities, noting resources, and documenting everything they found. The survey team carried out their assignment with thoroughness and efficiency. Verses 8 to 9 describe their work. As the men started on their way to map out the land, Joshua instructed them, "Go and make a survey of the land and write a description of it. Then return to me, and I will cast lots for you here at Shiloh in the presence of the Lord." So the men left and went through the land. They wrote its description on a scroll, town by town, in 7 parts, and returned to Joshua in the camp at Shiloh. The fact that they wrote their findings on a scroll, town by town, shows the detailed nature of their work. This wasn't a rough sketch or general overview. It was a comprehensive geographical and demographic survey that would serve as the basis for permanent tribal boundaries. When the survey was complete, Joshua proceeded with the lot-casting ceremony. Verse 10 records, "Joshua then cast lots for them in Shiloh in the presence of the Lord, and there he distributed the land to the Israelites according to their tribal divisions." The lot casting took place in the presence of the Lord at the tabernacle, emphasizing that these assignments came from God rather than human decision-making. Each tribe received exactly what God intended for them. The 7 tribal assignments were then described in detail. Benjamin received territory between Judah and Joseph. Simeon was given land within Judah's territory in the south. Zebulun got hill country in the north. Issachar received the eastern portion of the Jezreel Valley. Asher was assigned the coastal territory north of Mount Carmel. Naphtali got the northernmost territory around the Sea of Galilee. And Dan initially received territory west of Benjamin. The final assignment was special and personal. Joshua 19:49-50 records, "When they had finished dividing the land into its allotted portions, the Israelites gave Joshua son of Nun an inheritance among them. As the Lord had commanded, they gave him the town he asked for, Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim, and he built up the town and settled there." After ensuring that every tribe received their proper inheritance, Joshua finally accepted a personal portion for himself. His willingness to wait until everyone else was taken care of before claiming his own inheritance shows the kind of selfless leadership that had made him so effective. With the tribal territories assigned, two final administrative tasks remained that were crucial for justice and religious life in Israel. God had given specific commands about establishing cities of refuge and providing cities for the Levites, and now was the time to implement these important institutions. The cities of refuge addressed a critical need in ancient society: what to do when someone killed another person accidentally. Without a proper legal system, such situations often led to blood feuds and cycles of revenge that could destroy entire families and communities. Joshua 21:3 records God's instructions about establishing these special cities. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Tell the Israelites to designate the cities of refuge, as I instructed you through Moses, so that anyone who kills a person accidentally and unintentionally may flee there and find protection from the avenger of blood." The concept was both merciful and practical. Someone who caused an accidental death could flee to one of these cities and be safe from revenge while their case was properly investigated. This prevented hasty executions and gave the legal system time to determine whether a death was truly accidental or intentional murder. The procedure for using these cities was carefully regulated. The fugitive had to present their case to city elders, who would evaluate whether the claim of accidental killing was credible. If accepted, they would be protected from revenge, but couldn't simply return home immediately. 6 cities were designated as refuges, strategically located throughout the land. Verses 7 to 8 list them. So they set apart Kadesh in Galilee, in the hill country of Naphtali, Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. East of the Jordan, on the other side from Jericho, they designated Bezer in the wilderness on the plateau, in the tribe of Reuben, Ramoth in Gilead, in the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan, in the tribe of Manasseh. The geographical distribution ensured that no one in Israel was more than a day's journey from a city of refuge. 3 cities were west of the Jordan, and 3 were east, providing coverage for all the tribal territories. Remarkably, this protection was extended even to foreigners living among the Israelites. The system was designed to ensure justice for everyone, regardless of their ethnic background. The second major administrative task involved providing cities for the Levites. Unlike the other tribes, Levi hadn't received a territorial inheritance. Instead, they were to be scattered throughout all the tribes to provide religious leadership and instruction. Joshua 21:1-3 describes how this was implemented. Now the family heads of the Levites approached Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the other tribal clans of Israel at Shiloh in Canaan, and said to them, "The Lord commanded through Moses that you give us towns to live in, with pasture lands for our livestock." So, as the Lord had commanded, the Israelites gave the Levites the following towns and pasture lands out of their own inheritance. The Levites didn't demand their cities. They respectfully approached the leadership and reminded them of God's command through Moses. Their request was both reasonable and necessary. They needed places to live and pasture their animals. But more importantly, every tribe needed Levites among them to maintain proper worship and teach God's law. The total allocation was substantial. Verses 41-42 provide the summary. The towns of the Levites in the territory held by the Israelites were 48 in all, together with their pasture lands. Each of these towns had pasture lands surrounding it. This was true for all these towns. 48 cities represented a significant commitment from the other tribes. Each tribe had to give up some of their most valuable real estate to provide for the Levites. But this arrangement served everyone's interests by ensuring that religious leadership would be available throughout the land. The completion of these assignments marked the fulfillment of all God's promises regarding the land. Verses 43-45 provide a powerful conclusion. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to the people of Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled. Every promise God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been kept. The land was theirs, their enemies were defeated, and they had rest from war. The cities of refuge provided justice. The Levitical cities ensured proper worship, and the tribal territories gave everyone a permanent inheritance. With the land divided among the tribes, there was still one crucial system that needed to be established, a way to protect people who killed someone by accident. In ancient times, when someone died, their family had the right to take revenge on the killer. But what if the death was truly an accident? The Lord spoke to Joshua about this important matter in chapter 20, verse 2. "Tell the Israelites to designate the cities of refuge as I instructed you through Moses." These wouldn't be ordinary cities. They would be special places where someone who killed accidentally could run for safety. The purpose was clear and merciful. Verse 3 explains, "So that anyone who kills a person accidentally and unintentionally may flee there and find protection from the Avenger of Blood." The Avenger of Blood was usually the closest male relative of the person who died. Under the law, this person had the right and duty to track down the killer and execute him. The process was carefully designed to be both fair and protective. Verses 4-6 describe exactly how it would work. When they flee to one of these cities, they are to stand in the entrance of the city gate and state their case before the elders of that city. Then the elders are to admit the fugitive into their city and provide a place to live among them. If the Avenger of Blood comes in pursuit, the elders must not surrender the fugitive, because the fugitive killed their neighbor unintentionally and without malice aforethought. This system protected innocent people while still respecting the rights of families who had lost someone. The fugitive had to present their case to the city elders, who would decide if the claim of accidental killing was believable. 6 cities were chosen to serve as refuges, spread throughout the entire land. Verses 7-8 list them. So they set apart Kadesh in Galilee in the hill country of Naphtali, Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. East of the Jordan they designated Bezer in the wilderness, on the plateau in the tribe of Reuben, Ramoth in Gilead in the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan in the tribe of Manasseh. The geographical distribution was perfect. 3 cities were west of the Jordan River and 3 were east of it. No matter where someone lived in Israel, they were never more than a day's journey from safety. The tribe of Levi had a unique situation in Israel. Unlike the other tribes, they hadn't received a large territory to call their own. Instead, their inheritance was to serve God and teach His law to the people. But they still needed places to live and land for their animals. The Levites approached the leadership respectfully to claim what God had promised them. Joshua 21:1-2 records their request. Now the family heads of the Levites approached Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the other tribal clans of Israel at Shiloh in Canaan, and said to them, "The Lord commanded through Moses that you give us towns to live in, with pasture lands for our livestock." The other tribes responded obediently. Verse 3 tells us, "So as the Lord had commanded, the Israelites gave the Levites the following towns and pasturelands out of their own inheritance." The Levites were divided into 3 main family groups, and each group received cities in different areas. The descendants of Aaron, who served as priests, got the most important assignment. They received cities in the territories closest to where the temple would eventually be built in Jerusalem. The total number of cities was impressive. Verses 41-42 provide the summary. The towns of the Levites in the territory held by the Israelites were 48 in all, together with their pasture lands. Each of these towns had pasture lands surrounding it. This was true for all these towns. 48 cities with their surrounding pasturelands represented a major commitment from the other tribes. They were giving up some of their most valuable real estate to provide for the Levites. But this arrangement benefited everyone by ensuring that religious leadership and instruction would be available throughout the entire land. The completion of this distribution marked something incredibly significant. Verses 43-45 contain some of the most important words in the entire book. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to the people of Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled. Every single promise that God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had come true. The land was theirs, their enemies were defeated, and they had rest from war. With the land distribution complete, Joshua turned his attention to the 2.5 tribes who had been fighting alongside their brothers for years. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh had left their families and homes on the east side of the Jordan River to help conquer the western territories. Now it was time for them to return home. Joshua called these tribes together for a special ceremony. Chapter 22 verses 1-3 record his words. Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, "You have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, and you have obeyed me in everything I commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your fellow Israelites, but have carried out the mission the Lord your God gave you." These tribes had made an incredible sacrifice. Years earlier, they had promised to help their brothers conquer the west side before returning to their own families. They had kept that promise faithfully. Joshua announced that their military service was complete. Verses 4-5 contain his official dismissal. Now that the Lord your God has given them rest, as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. But be very careful to keep the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commands, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. But Joshua didn't send them home empty-handed. Verses 7-8 describe his generous blessing. When Joshua dismissed them to their homes, he blessed them, saying, "Return to your homes with your great wealth, with large herds of livestock, with silver, gold, bronze, and iron, and a great quantity of clothing, and divide the plunder from your enemies with your fellow tribesmen." The eastern tribes had become wealthy through their share of the conquest plunder. Joshua told them to take this wealth home and share it with their relatives who had stayed behind. The eastern tribes' journey home should have been a happy ending to their years of faithful service. But something happened along the way that nearly caused a civil war among the tribes of Israel. Chapter 22 verse 10 describes what they did. When they came to Geliloth near the Jordan in the land of Canaan, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh built an imposing altar there by the Jordan. When news reached the western tribes, they were horrified. Building an altar outside the designated place of worship looked like rebellion against God's commands. The reaction was swift and intense. Verses 11-12 show how seriously the western tribes took this situation. And when the Israelites heard that they had built the altar on the border of Canaan at Geliloth near the Jordan on the Israelite side, the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. The western tribes were ready to fight their own brothers. They thought the eastern tribes were starting their own rival religion, which would bring God's judgment on all of Israel. But before they attacked, they decided to send a delegation to find out what was really going on. They sent Phinehas the priest and 10 tribal leaders to investigate. When they reached the eastern tribes, Phinehas delivered a stern message accusing them of rebellion. The eastern tribes were shocked by this accusation. They quickly explained their true motives. Verses 24 to 27 reveal their concern. But we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, "What do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you Reubenites and Gadites. You have no share in the Lord. So your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord. That is why we said, let us get ready and build an altar, but not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. On the contrary, it is to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at his sanctuary." Their motive was actually the opposite of rebellion. They were trying to preserve their connection to God and their fellow Israelites. They were worried that future generations might forget that the eastern tribes were part of Israel. The altar was meant to be a witness, a reminder that they too belonged to the Lord. The explanation completely changed everything. What had seemed like rebellion was actually faithfulness. The crisis was over, and civil war was avoided through honest communication. Years passed after the altar crisis was resolved. Joshua was growing old, and he knew his time as leader was coming to an end. Chapter 23, verse 1 sets the scene. After a long time had passed and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then a very old man, Joshua called together all the leaders of Israel for an important meeting. He began his speech by reminding them of everything God had done for them. Verse 3 contains his opening words. "You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you." Joshua wanted to make sure they understood that their success hadn't come from their own strength. God had fought for them and given them victory over every enemy. But then came the most important part of his speech, the warnings. Verses 6 to 8 contain his urgent appeal. Be very strong, be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have until now. This was the key to continued success. They had to obey God's law completely, avoid compromising with pagan religions, and maintain their exclusive loyalty to the Lord. Then came the sobering warning about what would happen if they disobeyed. Verses 12 to 13 spell out the consequences. But if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. The choice was clear. Faithfulness to God would bring continued blessing, but turning away from God to follow pagan practices would bring disaster. Sometime after his first farewell address, Joshua felt the need to gather the people one more time. This would be his final speech to the nation, and he chose Shechem, a location with deep historical significance. Chapter 24, verse 1 describes this gathering. Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua began his final speech not with his own words, but with a message from God himself. Verse 2 introduces this divine proclamation. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says." What followed was a sweeping review of Israel's history from God's perspective. The historical review started with Abraham's family before they knew the true God. Verses 2 to 3 begin the story. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac. God reminded them that their story began with his grace, not their goodness. Abraham's family had been idol worshippers like everyone else, but God had chosen Abraham and called him away from his homeland. The story of the Exodus received special attention. Verses 5-7 recount this dramatic rescue. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out. When I brought your ancestors out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. But they cried out to the Lord, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians. He brought the sea over them and covered them. The conquest was described as God's work, not Israel's achievement. Verses 11-13 summarize these victories. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho. The citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites, but I gave them into your hands. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you, also the 2 Amorite kings. You did not do it with your own sword and bow. So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them, and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. This historical review reminded the people that everything they had was a gift from God, not something they had earned through their own efforts. After reviewing their history, Joshua presented the people with the most important choice they would ever make. His challenge was direct and personal. Verse 14 contains his call to decision. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But Joshua didn't want a hasty decision. Verse 15 presents the options clearly. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Joshua's personal declaration became one of the most famous statements in the Bible. He was willing to stand alone if necessary, but he wanted everyone to know where he stood. The people's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Verses 16-18 record their declaration. Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt, from that land of slavery, and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord, because he is our God." But Joshua wasn't satisfied with their quick response. His next words were surprising. Verses 19-20 contain his warning. Joshua said to the people, "You are not able to serve the Lord. He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you." Joshua was trying to make sure they understood that serving God was serious business. God's holiness meant that he couldn't overlook sin. His jealousy meant that he wouldn't share their devotion with other gods. The people insisted they understood. They reaffirmed their commitment, and Joshua made them witnesses against themselves. Now came the practical test. Verse 23 contains Joshua's immediate demand. Now then, throw away the foreign gods that are among you, and yield your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel. If they were serious about serving God, they had to prove it by getting rid of their idols right now. The people passed the test and made their final pledge of loyalty. Joshua wanted to make sure this covenant renewal was permanently recorded. Verse 25 describes the formal process. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem he reaffirmed for them decrees and laws. The written record was crucial. Verse 26 tells us, "And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord." This stone would serve as a witness to the covenant. Joshua explained its significance in verse 27. Joshua said to all the people, "See, this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God." With the covenant renewal complete, Joshua dismissed the people for the last time. Not long after this, the great leader's life came to an end. Verse 29 records Joshua's death. After these things, Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. Joshua was called the servant of the Lord, the same title that had been given to Moses. He was buried in his own inheritance at Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim. Around the same time, Eleazar the high priest also died. But there was one more burial that needed to be recorded. Verse 32 tells us, "And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem." This burial fulfilled a promise that was centuries old. When Joseph was dying in Egypt, he had made his family swear that they would carry his bones back to the promised land. Now finally, he was laid to rest in the soil of the promised land. The book ends with a testimony to Joshua's lasting influence. Verse 31 provides this summary. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua's leadership had been so effective that it continued to influence Israel even after his death. This was Joshua's greatest legacy, not just the military victories, but the spiritual foundation he had laid for future generations. If Joshua's story inspired you, do me 3 quick favors. Hit subscribe and the notification bell for more powerful biblical stories that will strengthen your faith. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about God's faithfulness and victory. Drop a comment telling me which part of Joshua's journey impacted you most. Remember Joshua's challenge, choose this day whom you will serve. The God of Joshua is your God today. He's ready to give you victory over every giant in your life. Thanks for watching and God bless you.